Now, Executive Suite with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
When it comes to reviving metro area economies, there's one man who leads the intellectual pack, Bruce Katz. A director at Washington's famed Brookings Institution, Katz has gained national renown for his landmark work on what makes a city thrive. So Treasurer Gina Raimondo brought Katz to Providence for talks with business leaders about Rhode Island's economic struggles. This week, on the first half of Executive Suite, a prescription for Providence from Brookings Institution Vice President Bruce Katz. Plus, is law school still worth it? With student debt soaring and legal jobs scarce, the American Bar Association considers major changes in how lawyers get trained. On the second half of Executive Suite, we'll talk to a local attorney on the National Task Force, Thomas Lyons. Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. Anybody who follows the urban policy debate knows the name Bruce Katz. Katz is a vice president at the Brookings Institution, the major Washington think tank, and he's also the director of Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. He was in Rhode Island this week at the invitation of Treasurer Raimondo, and I sat down with the two of them to talk about his prescription for how to turn things around in Rhode Island. Let's watch. Treasurer Bruce, thanks for sitting down with me today.
Thank you.
We have both you here. Now, Bruce, I'm told this is hardly your first visit to Rhode Island.
No, I actually went to Camp Fuller in Narragansett for, I think, 8 summers, and I went to Brown University.
Brown University as well, so you know the state pretty well. How different does Providence look from when you were here as an undergrad?
Well, you daylighted the river. That was a bridge when I was here, and now you took down the freeway. So, unbelievable transformative change in the physical landscape of Providence.
Now, in the wonky world that I like to dwell in, Treasurer, Bruce is one of the best known urban policy and economic experts. Why did you think it would be a good idea to bring him here to Rhode Island?
Well, as I've asked people who is really great at economic development and creating economic opportunity, I consistently hear you have to talk to Bruce Katz and Brookings. You know, they have an approach that has a track record of success. They've worked in Cleveland and Buffalo and New York, other places with success. So, we have an economic problem. We have the highest unemployment rate in the country. We have to act with urgency. We can't be doing enough, and I was delighted that he agreed to come and spend a couple of days with us.
All right, well, let's dive right in there. Before we talk specifically on economic development, I want to give people a sense, Bruce, of where you're coming from. How do you describe the American economy before the crash and where we're going now?
Well, I think before the crash, the United States had essentially a growth model that was based on consumption and debt and, frankly, innovating in the wrong things. The recession was a wake-up call. Prior to the recession, we had lost millions of manufacturing jobs in this country. We had taken our eye off the ball, off the fundamentals. Post-recession, the recovery which we've had, still anemic, has been primarily driven by a resurgence in manufacturing and a resurgence in exports and trade, because that's where demand is in the world, outside of our borders. So I think post-recession, if you talk to Jeff Immelt of GE, if you talk to mainstream economists, what they would say is the U.S. has to restructure its economy to the fundamentals. An economy fueled by innovation, manufacturing, tech, advanced industry, advanced services, an economy that is driven by exports and global engagement. That's how you create more jobs, and frankly, that's how you create better jobs, better wages, better benefits.
And the Treasurer had you meet with a number of business leaders, with other elected officials during your trip here. And one of your big messages when I heard you speak is that federal gridlock means cities and states are on their own. You have some tough words for the federal government. What's your thought there?
Well, I'd view the federal government as having left the building, frankly. I mean, it is a failed state, and others have basically said that the biggest threat to the American economy is the United States Congress right now, with sequestration looming. So we could be back into much more difficult times because of the cuts that the federal government is about to rain down. We still have to get the federal fiscal house in order, but there's a smart way to do that and there's a really stupid way to do that. So I think cities and metropolitan areas, first and foremost, and Rhode Island is a metropolitan state, they're the engines of our economy, they're the centers of trade and investment, they are on the front lines of demographic change. They are powerful entities. In most other countries in the world, the central government is all powerful. We're a union of states with cities and metropolitan areas that really have our economic assets. So they're on their own. but they have power, they have resources, and they have distinct economies that they can leverage and build on.
And you took a look specifically before you came here at Providence, Providence region's economic performance over the last decade or so. What did you see in those numbers?
Well, the numbers are tough. I mean, the Treasurer said it. I mean, you've got tough employment figures. I mean, you've got slow population growth, productivity numbers that they're not anything to brag at, decline in wages. I mean, these are tough numbers, and we do work all over the country. And you know, you're there with Nevada essentially, which is we can understand why Nevada got hit in this recession because it was a consumption recession. You know, you also have assets. Right? You also have very distinct assets in advanced industries off your base of universities, whether it's Brown, whether it's RISD, whether it's Johnson and Wales. You've got community colleges that are really the workhorses of the economy. It's important to think about the ecosystem of innovation. If we went to Silicon Valley today and you asked them, why are you guys so successful? They just wouldn't talk about celebrity entrepreneurs. What they would talk about is Stanford, clusters of firms, intermediaries that basically help them supply the skilled workers and the special capital. It's an ecosystem, not just an enterprise. And I think you've got good physical bones here, but you also have some great sectors and clusters to build on.
There's some fatalism, though, you hear in Rhode Island these days, where people feel like, you know what, we are just, pardon my words, screwed. You know, the place is too small, and the economy's left us behind, and people don't have a lot of faith in the state's elites. What do you think of that? Do you hear that when you go to other places, a lack of civic confidence?
We hear that in some places. We don't hear that everywhere. And we need to understand, you know, if we went to Portland, Oregon, you know, or we went to Seattle 30 years ago, you went to New York City 40 years ago, you would have basically heard similar stories, right? And yet those places have roared back. They're bigger places, right? But there's a cycle to this. And what we need to understand is if we focus on the fundamentals, you know, we don't focus on building another stadium or a convention center or another mall or another consumption play, but we focus on those sectors of the economy that actually drive everything else. Advanced industry, advanced manufacturing, advanced services, be at the cutting edge. Last couple of days, what I've heard here, which I knew because I had gone to school here, is the power of RISD and design and how that relates to manufacturing. Is the power of Brown in your healthcare cluster and how that potentially could be at the cutting edge of brain science and how that could affect medical devices and technology. There are assets here, and we've only scratched the surface. So I tend to take the view that the United States is an advanced economy, an open society, an incredible network of entrepreneurial firms and advanced research institutions. But places have distinct economies, and it's really up to them, given that the federal government is now collapsing and not providing leadership, to step up, create networks of leaders, set your distinct vision, and then not just design, but deliver on game-changing initiatives.
We have to take a break. When we come back, more on economic development with Bruce Katz and Gina Raimondo. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. This week I sat down with the influential Brookings Institution scholar Bruce Katz to talk about how Rhode Island can turn around its economy. We were joined by Treasurer Gina Raimondo, who invited Katz to Rhode Island. Here's the rest of our interview. Let me ask you, Treasurer, people, you hear the conversation in Rhode Island that I do. There's not a lot of confidence necessarily in our leaders. You hear people, especially after 38 Studios, say, why would we trust these folks to do another plan or another set of actions or take some major initiatives? People say, I don't trust this. We just blew $100 million on a video game. What's your message to voters who are thinking that way?
Well, first of all, we can't give up. Just because other efforts have failed, that's not a reason to not try. We have 60,000 people out of work and thousands more underemployed. You know, that's families that are struggling. We have to work harder. It means we have to try a different approach with different people, but we can't stop. We have to do more in different ways. One of the things I love about the Brookings approach is it's very bottoms up. So what we're really talking about here is creating kind of a movement among Rhode Islanders. It's not top down. We're not going to be saved by the government. Rhode Island has to save itself from the bottom up of business leaders, civic leaders, and government leaders saying, let's get this done. And I like his approach of engaging stakeholders, broadly across the state.
Bruce, what about the question of scale? There's reports we've gotten just last week from Fourth Economy says that a bunch of the indicators economically are good for Rhode Island on the knowledge economy. We have a lot of workers with college degrees, and yet there's little evidence it's helped our economy. Could scale be a problem for Providence compared with when we're near Boston and New York and we're a lot tinier?
Well, I think being near Boston is a huge, is a huge asset, a huge advantage. I mean, I could go to any number of cities in the heartland of this country who would kill to be near Boston. You're an hour away by Amtrak. So I think location actually works for you. The question is, off of what are some really good physical assets, great location, housing that's relative, more affordable, and off this base of knowledge institutions, talented workers, entrepreneurial firms, I mean, how do you deliberately and purposefully grow that? Some of it may be related to who are your partners abroad, frankly. Most of the demand right now is outside the United States. 95% of the consumers in this world are outside the United States. So we need to begin to change our mental map around market opportunities. Boston's really critical, and there's a lot of synergy, and we'll discover more with that megalopolis. But there may be synergies in Europe, but also, frankly, in Asia and Latin America that could be explored.
And during your visit, I know you mentioned at the top, the land in Providence freed up by relocating 195 compared to when you were here as a student. What was your reaction when you saw the change there?
Oh, it's a mind blower. I mean, I have felt for a long period of time as an urbanist that we have to undo the mistakes of the 1950s when freeways came into our cities and basically separated them from the waterfront and separated different institutional assets, right? The higher ed institutions from your medical campuses. So in many respects, what's been happening in the US, in Milwaukee, in other parts of the country, is tearing down, literally tearing down mistakes, highway mistakes, and then freeing up incredibly valuable land that hopefully can be reused for innovative purposes. So most cities would kill for what you have, okay? I mean, you're in walking distance of your downtown, walking distance of the Hill, walking distance of your medical campus. We'll look back 50 years from now, and if you do the right thing here and say, that was the beginning of the resurgence.
One more for you, and then I'll have one last question for the Treasurer. We talk a lot about taxes and the impact taxes have on Rhode Island's economy. When you look at the full spectrum of how development happens, how important is the question of your tax rates in whether the economy thrives?
Yeah, I think general business climate, and I would put taxes in there, is part of the equation. But when I talk to many companies, what they talk about is proximity to knowledge institutions, a steady supply, a reliable supply of skilled workers, and certainty and predictability, right? So taxes are part of the equation, right? But they're not the beginning and the end of the conversation, right? So, and it depends, obviously, from one sector to another. But we can go to some parts of this country that are low tax, and there's no innovative activity going on whatsoever. And then we can go to other parts of the country that are relatively high tax, and they're the center of the global economy. So there's something else going on here besides taxes. Proximity matters, talented workers matter, and this constant regeneration and continuous innovation fundamentally matters.
And Treasurer, I have one question for you. People are going to look at this and say, well, everyone's talking about whether the Treasurer might run for governor. Now she's putting her feet into the economic development question, a big issue here. Is this a sign that we'll see you on the ballot for governor in 2014?
No, it is not a sign that you'll see me on the ballot. I've been a consistent advocate for creating economic development in Rhode Island. In fact, pension reform was all about that. It was about making tough choices to fix our fiscal fundamentals so we could grow again. So this is really a natural extension of that. And it's back to what I began with. Highest unemployment rate in the country, we can't do enough. Everyone, not just elected officials, should be waking up saying, what can I do? What more can we do? And this is one attempt to play a role in revitalizing our state.
We have to take another break. When we come back, is the law school model broken? We'll talk to a local lawyer who's on the American Bar Association task force looking at that question. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. My guest for this segment is Thomas Lyons. He's a partner at the law firm Strauss, Factor, Lang & Lyons in Providence. Tom, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I want to dive right in on this heated debate about law school and the future of legal education, and you're right at the heart of it. The New York Times reported recently law school applications headed this year for a 30-year low, down 20%. What do you think is happening out there?
Well, I think what's happening is college students are finally getting the news that there's a glut of lawyers and that law school is relatively expensive to go to, and they're deciding not to incur large amounts of debt to make that investment.
And those debt numbers are pretty startling. I looked up again. This is from the Times. Average tuition at a private law school since 2001 has gone from $23,000 to $40,000. Average debt from $70,000 to $125,000. And the dean of Roger Williams Law School tells me average student debt was $132,000 there in 2012. What do you make of those numbers?
Well, what they do is they make the practice of law a bad investment for a lot of people. Roughly half the starting jobs now pay salaries between $45,000 and $60,000. So if you've incurred over $100,000 worth of debt, you find out that you're living basically hand to mouth in order to take one of those jobs and pay off your debt at the same time. It's really not a good economic decision for a lot of people.
How different is it from when you were in law school? We won't make you give away your age, but how much has it changed?
Well, 30 years ago, actually, I graduated from law school. I borrowed $5,000 a year to go to law school. That plus the money I made from part-time and summer jobs paid for law school. So I graduated with $15,000 in debt. I had a job that's starting salary of $25,000, and with that I could rent an apartment, buy a car. After a couple of years, my wife and I bought a house. It worked out fairly well for us. The situation is completely flipped now. You have people who are coming out with $100,000, $150,000 in debt with a job that pays $50,000 a year, and they're living like paupers practically.
So you're here because you were just quoted in that Times article. The American Bar Association created this task force on the future of legal education, and you're on it. What's the mission they've given you on the task force, and how long are we looking at to get a product?
Well, there are three things we initially considered. One is the oversupply of lawyers coming out of law schools. I think essentially we decided we're going to let the market take care of that, and it appears from the application numbers that that's happening. The other two issues we're looking at are the cost of law school, what can the ABA do about it as the accrediting organization or otherwise, and what is the substantive content of a legal education. Should that be changed so that when lawyers come out, they're more ready to begin practicing law already and don't need that much more training?
And how long are we looking at for the work?
Well, actually, we're supposed to present a proposal to the ABA by this fall. So we're working on a very short time frame.
And how'd you end up on it? People be a little proud that we have a Providence lawyer on this national task force.
Well, for about 6 years now, I've been doing presentations on the future of the practice of law generally with a fellow who's a past president of the Connecticut Bar Association named Fred Urey. This past year, Fred was president of the National Conference of Bar Presidents. The ABA president called him to ask him to be on a task force. He declined, but volunteered me.
So here you are.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about a couple of the ideas I've seen thrown around. First one, pretty simple idea, switching law school from a model of 3 years to 2 years. What do you think of that?
Well, there's actually a lot of people who are advocates of that. We had a recent meeting and a hearing at the ABA mid-year meeting in Dallas, at which one of the people who spoke had done a study 40 years ago now, making that exact recommendation. His name is Professor Carrington. He's the former dean of Duke Law School. And he came up and said he thought it was still a good idea. There's a lot of people who think that 2 years of academic training is really all you need to be a lawyer. There's some controversy over whether or not the third year should be abolished or whether it should be more of a training session where you do, for example, externships or clinics, that sort of thing. But I think some shift, some change in the ABA accreditation standards that would allow that is likely.
Another interesting thing I was reading, Washington State has created a program for what they call limited license legal technicians, not full lawyers. To me as a layman, they almost sound like nurse practitioners versus doctors. What do you think of that? And do you think Rhode Island should look at it?
It's fairly controversial, to say the least. The idea is that you can find somebody who can provide legal services to the public less expensively, which is a good idea. I mean, there's a lot of, it's ironic that the situation is we have a glut of lawyers and yet very few people can afford one, in part because it's been so expensive to get legal training. So a cheaper legal service provider would be helpful. There's a lot of concern about whether or not those people would be able to operate independently or whether they'd have to be supervised by another lawyer, and if so, would that really help? I think a lot of people are going to look at the Washington State experiment very closely.
How much do the law schools themselves to blame for this? I have talked to students who feel like the schools have jacked up prices and maximized revenue, even though there weren't as many job opportunities as they expected when they got out. How do you see that part of it?
Well, frankly, the law schools operated as you would expect someone to do in a business environment. There was a huge demand for legal education. You know, a lot of people wanted to go to law school. Demand pushed the price up. There was a lot of competition based on U.S. News and World Report to improve rankings, and frankly, being more expensive actually helps your ranking, which is one thing. Because of that, the law schools were able to charge more money. So in a way, they bear blame, but they were reacting the way almost any other business would react.
Market signals, yeah.
In a similar situation.
University of Massachusetts has added a lower cost law school right over the border in Dartmouth. Do you think that's something Rhode Island should be looking at doing?
Well, I honestly don't think we need more law schools. What we need are less expensive law schools. And that's part of what the task force is looking at. What can the task force do, for example, about ABA accreditation standards that to some extent impose costs on legal education that we could reduce? For example, faculty-student ratios, library requirements, which are now kind of outdated in the digital age. How many professors have to be on a tenure track, that sort of thing.
Now, we only have about 30 seconds left, so I got to ask, when a young person comes to you now and says, should I go to law school, what's your reply?
My reply is either get into a great law school like Harvard or go to a law school that's going to cost you relatively cheap, either because they're giving you a lot of aid or because it's just not that expensive anyway. There are jobs out there, but if it's going to cost you more than, say, $20,000, $25,000 a year to go to law school, you have to think carefully about it.
All right, that's all the time we have for this episode. I want to thank Thomas Lyons for joining me for the second half here to talk about law schools. Earlier in the show, we had Bruce Katz from the Brookings Institution on economic development. If you missed any of it, you can catch it all on our website, WPRI.com. Just click on air. We'll see you next week on Executive Suite.